Hello, welcome to another video. This one is on our anterior, medial, and posterior thigh mnemonics. Since it is kind of a hefty video, it is a little bit longer than what I would hope, but I hope you stick with me throughout this video and hope you learn something from it. Just as a little disclaimer, this video does contain some cadaver pictures just to get you oriented while you're in the lab, so just be aware of that. By talking about anterior thigh. Before we talk about anterior thigh muscles specifically, we're first going to talk about the femoral triangle and its borders. Here on this picture, we can see the surface anatomy of the femoral triangle, and if we look deeper at the actual muscles, we can see the border of the femoral triangle as well. Its superior border is the inguinal ligament running across here. Its medial border is the adductor longus, and that muscle is highlighted. The lateral border is the sartorius muscle, and the medial floor is made up of the pectineus muscle. Now, some textbooks might say that the adductor longus also plays a role in making up the medial floor, so be aware of that. The lateral floor is made up of the iliopsoas muscle, which we can see highlighted here. Just as a reminder, this iliopsoas muscle is made up of two muscles that can be found in the abdomen. These muscles are the iliacus and the psoas major. So as I was saying, if we're looking at the femoral triangle, now we're going to look at the contents. So let's take a zoomed in picture of the contents of the femoral triangle. Just to reorient yourself to this zoomed in picture, we have our sartorius muscle, our adductor longus, pectineus, and our iliopsoas muscles, and all of those are contributing to making up our femoral triangle. There's a mnemonic to remember what goes on in the femoral triangle, and that mnemonic is navel, okay? And this abbreviation goes from lateral to medial. So if we're going from lateral to medial in this zoomed in picture of the femoral triangle, first we see our nerve, or specifically our femoral nerve, followed by our artery, or our femoral artery, and then our V stands for our femoral vein, and then lastly the L stands for our lymphatics, or in this case, our deep inguinal lymph nodes. Now, let's see these structures on a cadaver dissection. Just for reorientation, we have our sartorius muscle, adductor longus, pectineus, and our iliopsoas. Now let's find our navel. We have femoral nerve, femoral artery, femoral vein, and it's been removed in this donor, but our lymphatics would be right about here going through our femoral canal. So now that we talked about the femoral triangle, let's move on and talk about the anterior thigh muscles. As I've always said, one of the best ways to learn anatomy is by grouping. So in this compartment, we have 4 muscles that we're going to look at, some of which we've actually just seen in our femoral triangle. So the first muscle we're going to look at is our iliopsoas. The next muscle is pectineus, and our third muscle is sartorius, and we've seen all of those before previously in our femoral triangle. The last muscle we're going to look at is a muscle group, and it is the quadriceps group. With the prefix quad, meaning 4, we're expecting 4 muscles to be a part of this group. So if we look at another picture where we stripped away all the muscles except the ones pertaining to the quadriceps group, we can name them all. The first muscle here we're going to look at is our rectus femoris, followed by our vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and if we make a cut right here across this quadriceps tendon and reflect away our rectus femoris, we see another muscle lying just underneath, and that is our vastus intermedius. If we dissect away our vastus lateralis and our vastus medialis from where they sit, we would then see the entirety of that vastus intermedius. Now, if we were to take that picture and swivel it over to the posterior side, with our vastus lateralis and medialis still intact, we can see where they attach on the posterior side of that femur. If we look at just the femur itself, we can see that little groove on the back called the linea aspera. There are several muscles that attach to this groove, and one of the major ones is the vastus lateralis and medialis. Interestingly enough, there's a paper that I found, which if you're interested in reading it at all, where it just talks about how this linea aspera is found surgically in order to identify the appropriate posterior part of the femur, since for most people the femur tends to be more externally rotated. So I thought it was a very interesting paper, and you're welcome to go see this as well. Let's generalize a little bit more. First of all, our iliopsoas and our pectineus muscles can be found pretty deep in this anterior thigh compartment. Also, if we're going to generalize the actions of these muscles, in general, they perform flexion at the hip and extension at the knee. Just remember, a muscle can only perform an action at a joint that it crosses. So for example, our pectineus muscle is only attached up here superiorly, and it does not cross the knee joint at all. In that case, we know that it will do flexion at the hip, but not extension of the knee. So keep that in mind. Additionally, all of these muscles are innervated by the femoral nerve. A handy mnemonic if you need to memorize the nerve roots of the femoral nerve. It's L234 kicks down the door. So just imagine if you're kicking down a door, in order to do that, you first have to flex at the hip and then extend your knee. Quickly focus on two of the muscles in this anterior thigh area because they have a little bit of exceptions dealing with them. The first muscle we're going to talk about is the iliopsoas muscle. So this muscle is one of the chief flexors of the hip joint, and it's also involved in postural stabilization, primarily because of its contributions from the psoas major muscle. The next muscle we're going to talk about is the pectineus muscle. So this muscle does flexion at the hip, and it also does some hip adduction. So because it has a dual function, it is also innervated by two different nerves. For performing hip flexion actions, it is innervated by the femoral nerve, as we would expect, and for any actions involving hip adduction, it is innervated by the obturator nerve. And because of this, this muscle is a transition muscle between the anterior thigh and the medial thigh. Go ahead and talk about muscles of the medial thigh. So in looking at the muscles of the medial thigh, we can group them into 5 muscles. Our first one is our adductor longus, which we can see here isolated in its entirety. Our next muscle is the pectineus muscle, which we just talked about as our transition muscle between anterior and medial thigh. Our third muscle sits nestled right in between the two, and that is our adductor brevis. Our fourth muscle is a thin little strap muscle located almost entirely medially, and that is our gracilis muscle. Our last muscle is the adductor magnus, which in this view on the right is actually a posterior view in order to see the full muscle belly. So now if we're going to make generalizations about this group, all of them do adduction at the hip. They're also all innervated by the obturator nerve. Move on, I want to talk a little bit more about the adductor magnus muscle. It's a little bit special in that it has a couple of functions and 2 different innervations because of that. This muscle does adduction at the hip, and it also does a little bit of flexion at the hip. These actions cause this part of the muscle to be innervated by the obturator nerve. Adductor magnus also does extension at the hip, And this portion of the muscle is innervated by the tibial part of the sciatic nerve. And as such, this muscle is also one of those transition muscles between the medial thigh compartment and the posterior thigh compartment. Let's move on and talk about posterior thigh muscles. So in our posterior thigh, there are three main muscles that we're going to be looking at. The first muscle is the semimembranosus muscle. Our next one is just superficial to it, called the semitendinosus. And then lastly, we have our biceps femoris muscle. This muscle has two heads. So if we look at the picture on the right, we're looking laterally at this isolated muscle. And what we can see if we're looking from a posterior view is the long head of the biceps femoris. And if we look laterally, we can see a little bit of that short head of the biceps femoris. A way that I try to remember differentiating and orienting myself is I look medially and I remember that the semimembranosus muscle is medial, just really emphasizing that M. And then I remember that that semitendinosus muscle, that tendon of it sits on top. So again, just emphasizing that T of the tendon of the semitendinosus muscle. Talk about some generalizations about the posterior thigh compartment. All of these muscles do extension of the hip and flexion of the knee. For these first three muscles, the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and the long head of the biceps femoris, they're innervated by the tibial division of the sciatic nerve. The short head of the biceps femoris is special in that it is innervated by the common fibular division of the sciatic nerve. Let's wrap up by talking about the pes anserinus. The pes anserinus. So the pes anserinus, so this structure is comprised of three muscles whose tendinous attachments insert on the medial portion of the tibia. So as we go through and name these muscles, we can see that one is a sartorius. Our second muscle we will talk about is the gracilis, and the third muscle is the semitendinosus. If we look at a medial view of the knee, we can see the tendon of the sartorius, the gracilis, and the semitendinosus muscles. So the reason why this is called the pes anserinus is because, according to anatomists, the insertion of these tendons resembles a duck's foot. So I guess if you line up that duck's foot with our tendons, I guess they kind of look like it. I don't know. So the important thing about the pes anserinus is that each of these muscles come from a different compartment. So we have the sartorius from the anterior compartment, the gracilis from the medial compartment, and the semitendinosus muscle from the posterior compartment, all coming together in this one area. A handy mnemonic to remember the muscles of the pes anserinus is Sergeant Fought. So our SGT all comes from our sartorius, gracilis, and the T of semitendinosus. And the FOT just corresponds with each of the muscles. So our F goes with the S, our O goes with the G, and our T goes with the T. And for that last part of the mnemonic, that just signifies the innervation for each of these muscles. So the sartorius muscle is innervated by the femoral nerve, the gracilis by obturator, and the semitendinosus by the tibial branch of sciatic. All right, so that's all the content that I wanted to cover for mnemonics, but I did want to leave you all with one last bad dad anatomy joke. So this time, what did the patella say to the femur? I need you! That's all I've got for y'all. Thank you so much for sticking with me for this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.